What's up everyone, it's the Law School Lumberjack here again with another video. Today we're going to be doing another installment of our LSAT tip series, and today we're going to be looking at sufficient assumption questions. Now I note that this is a companion video to a previous video I did on necessary assumption questions. If you want to check that out, that would be much appreciated. The two types of assumptions really play off each other, so watching both videos in a row I think will have a lot of value for you. So in this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some tips and tricks for answering sufficient assumption questions. Unlike a necessary assumption question, sufficient assumptions tend to be a bit more slippery, so it's harder to really hone in on a specific set of steps you can take when answering a sufficient assumption question. To really hammer down those tips and tricks, what I'm going to then do is I will give you a sample question and go through it with you to hopefully help show how to approach a sufficient assumption question. Now, the assumption questions are an essential part of the logical reasoning section. They make up a large portion of your marks in the logical reasoning section, so it's important to be able to understand how to answer them and how to differentiate between what is a necessary assumption question and what is a sufficient assumption question. The ability to answer those questions correctly requires you not only to understand how to answer each of those questions, but how to decipher from the question stem which type of assumption the test writer is looking for you to catch. So let's first talk about what a sufficient assumption is as compared to a necessary assumption. Now, if you've watched my previous video, this will be a bit of a refresher as we've gone through that in the necessary assumption video. So a necessary assumption is something that is required in order to make the argument work. In other words, if you take away the necessary assumption, the conclusion cannot stand and the argument breaks down. Now, a sufficient assumption, by contrast, is one that if you apply it or add it to the argument, it makes it so that the conclusion logically follows from the premises. In other words, the sufficient assumption bridges any gaps between the premises and the conclusion so that the conclusion must be true or must follow from the premises. So to clarify this for my students, what I always do is I analogize to a baking soda and vinegar volcano. If you remember as a little kid, you poured the baking soda and vinegar together and you got an explosion. Now, each of the baking soda and vinegar are necessary for the explosion. If you took either one or both of them away, you wouldn't have the chemical reaction. So they are in and of themselves necessary because they're required to make the explosion happen. However, neither on its own is sufficient. The sufficient condition is the combination of the baking soda and vinegar together. So by analogy, the sufficient assumption is something that when you apply it to the argument, it forces the conclusion given the premise. Similar to how if I combine baking soda and vinegar, the reaction naturally follows. So for those of you who have done some questions or may have written the exam, as I'm sure most of you are aware, the LSAT writers don't come out and ask you what's the necessary assumption or what's the sufficient assumption. They give you hints in the question stem as to what they're looking for. So some of the phrases that denote a sufficient assumption questions are phrases such as properly inferred or follows logically. So for example, if you read, the conclusion follows logically if which of the following is assumed, that's hinting that the writers are looking for a sufficient assumption question. A question stem that says, which of the following, if assumed, allows the conclusion to be properly inferred, also will denote a sufficient assumption question. Now, with the necessary assumption questions, if you've watched my previous video, you know that there is a time-consuming but effective method called the negation method to help you answer necessary assumption questions. Unfortunately, as far as I'm aware, there's not as easy a silver bullet way of answering sufficient assumption questions as there is with answering necessary assumption questions. As a result, I'm hoping to give you a couple tips on how to answer a sufficient assumption question, how to approach a sufficient assumption question in order to maximize your chances of getting the answer correct. So the first thing I'd recommend you do is, similar to with a necessary assumption question, figure out what the conclusion and the premises are. This is really important because if you know what the premises are and you know what the conclusion is, you're going to be able to figure out where the gaps are and what assumption is necessary to slot into the argument to make the conclusion follow logically from the premises. From there, what I recommend you do as a bit of a step 2 is to look at the gaps in the argument and see if you can pre-answer an assumption that when slotted in will allow the conclusion to necessarily follow. So if you pre-answer and your proposed assumption is one of the answer choices, you're likely to be correct. Now, that's not always going to happen, so if you are stuck or you cannot pre-answer or your proposed pre-answer isn't one of the answer choices, what you can do is try and eliminate some of the answer choices that are likely not correct. Now, unlike with a necessary assumption question where you're trying to get rid of all the overly broad statements, a sufficient assumption question actually favors those overly broad statements. So words such as all, none, never, always are oftentimes likely to be a correct answer. So any overly narrow choices, such as sometimes or a few, are less likely to be correct than the overly broad statements. Now, this is one of the reasons why it's extremely important to differentiate a necessary assumption from a sufficient assumption early on when you're first approaching the question. Because if you think it's a necessary assumption when it's actually sufficient, you're going to be looking for a very narrow answer when in fact you may be wanting to look for a broad answer. So going back to the task at hand, what you're going to want to do is look through the answer choices and see if there's any overly narrow choices and also any choices that are irrelevant to the argument. If those exist, you want to cross them out because they're likely not going to be the correct answer. You're also going to want to cross out anything that is an assumption that's necessary but isn't sufficient. The LSAT writers will often try to trick people by putting in a necessary assumption when in fact what you're trying to find is the sufficient assumption. So you also want to be careful for answers that sound correct but are backwards. So for example, if we take a very famous argument, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, a backwards answer would have worded that all mortal things are men. So you want to be very careful about the logical effect or the logical order of how the assumption is stated. Another tip I have is that if there are conditions in your argument, so if there's if-then statements, I recommend you actually draw those out and consider the contrapositive. By diagramming the argument and actually setting out the contrapositive, you're going to be much less likely to be caught by a backwards answer because you have the contrapositive written out. So as I said, unfortunately, unlike a necessary assumption question, the sufficient assumption question doesn't have a silver bullet. So as I did with a necessary assumption question, I think it may be helpful to go through a sample answer. So I'm going to put the question up here somewhere. So the question states, this stamp is probably highly valuable since it exhibits a printing error. The most important factor in determining a stamp's value, assuming that it is in good condition, are its rarity and age. This is clearly a fine specimen, and it is quite old as well. So the conclusion in this argument is the stamp is probably highly valuable. One of the supports or premises in this argument is it exhibits a printing error. The other premise, or one of the other supports, is that if the stamp is in good condition, the most important factors in determining its value are its rarity and age. And finally, the stamp in question is a good specimen, so we know it's in good condition, and it is quite old. Let's look at the premises and see what's missing to get to the conclusion. So we know that the stamp is in good condition. We know that if a stamp is in good condition, the most important factors for determining its worth are rarity and age. Well, we know that the stamp is old, so the question becomes, is the stamp rare? So the only thing that's now missing is proof that the stamp is rare. If the stamp's in good condition, it's old, and it's rare, we know that the conclusion's right because it's probably highly valuable. So the only things we've got here to suggest rarity is the printing error. But the printing error in and of itself is not going to prove rarity such that the conclusion has to logically follow. So the sufficient assumption should explicitly state that the printing error causes the stamp to be rare in essence. So if we look at the answers, the best answer here is B. Printing errors are always confined to a few individual stamps. Now, remember what I said before. We want a statement which is overly broad. A word such as always suggests it's going to be the right answer. Now, if printing errors are always confined to a few individual stamps, we know that a stamp with a printing error is going to be rare. So by doing that, we've proven that the stamp is rare. The support already tells us the stamp's in good condition and it is old. So from that, the conclusion being that the stamp is highly valuable naturally follows when we apply B, being the sufficient assumption, to the argument. So B is the right answer, and that's how you want to approach a sufficient assumption question. I hope this video was helpful. If it was, I'd really appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. Thank you very much. Take care. See you next time.